Okay, here's our interview with Miyoko.
I assume that in writing the book, you wanted the focus to be on what the state of being a female in the U.S. military is these days, especially in combat situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was hoping, was to give the reader a better idea about what it was like just in the day-to-day, something that was truer to life than, kind of the snippets you see in commercials or the stereotypes that are, kind of out there for what military life is like, to put a little bit more human and personal approach on it, I think, because there were some boring days. There were funny little everyday kind of things that happened that make it maybe not like the action movie most people think about when they think about war.
Yeah, well, I think it's fascinating. Any time spent in a combat zone is fascinating in and of itself. And then to be a female in combat zone, especially when that was kind of somewhat new. I mean, to have a woman in the position that you were in, I mean, how new was that at the time that you were there?
Well, there's kind of been a long history of releasing spaces and jobs to women in the military that are in various combat roles. And there's been a lot of controversy over that, because a lot of the more recent opening of jobs said, okay, now you can be in the battle space, or now you can be in a position where the primary job of the unit is to engage the enemy. But if you look back to before that, a truck driver's primary job isn't to engage the enemy, it's to move cargo. But if someone shoots at you, all of a sudden you become a part of the battle space. Mm-hmm. And so then all of a sudden that idea that that's not your primary function, it doesn't really matter, because all of a sudden it brings you into what you're there for and what's going on anyway. And so in a way, I think the American public has seen it to be more and more new. I think it's been there since the Revolutionary War. And I think it's just women have been getting more credit, and it's just become more and more open in a way that women could be seen in those roles in order to gain leadership roles. And I think that's been a primary difference.
Right. So at the time of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and you were there at 2003, 2004, what was permitted as far as women in combat roles?
There were a lot of areas that were not open yet. So field artillery units, there were still bans for women whose primary job was to engage the enemy, although there were always interesting exceptions. So in Afghanistan, where they had female engagement teams who worked side by side with, infantry or special forces operations, well, their primary job was to engage the rural women in Afghanistan in order to gain intelligence that was a part of the combat operation. So they were side by side in the space, but that wasn't their primary job, but it was still a very dangerous job. And so there were these little exceptions, a lot like that. The Army had a cultural team that functioned similarly. But yeah, no, at the time there was still this idea that women weren't in combat, even though that couldn't have been further from the truth.
And what is the current status today? Is there any limitations on women's ability to serve in combat roles?
It's basically open, but individual service branches can file different exceptions. And I think they have, but most of those are, for all practical purposes, going away, because at the time that a few women passed the Army Rangers course, once that starts to happen, that's really going to open that up and lead the way for that to just continue to happen. So virtually most jobs are open now. Practically, we're just seeing women complete the courses to actually get into those jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Navy SEALs, I think we've had one or more women, right?
Mm-hmm. Who are getting there now.
Yeah. But Army Rangers, you're saying, also Army have Rangers, females, and
Marine
then
officer infantry. Women have passed that course also,
and even fighter pilots.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what? Tell us about your time in Iraq in a combat zone as a woman and some of those challenges.
I don't know if my challenges were a lot different than most of the men who were there, kind of in the same space. I think it's a very dynamic environment. Uh, Never really know what's going to happen, and there are long periods of doing a lot of other things, and then there are these short periods of activity where, in retrospect, seem to stretch on for long periods of time. If that makes sense at all, those bigger moments do seem to slow down in time. But as a woman, probably not that much different. I don't know. I don't know that if I talked to any of my male battle buddies, they would have said, thank God I was a man. It was much easier. I don't know if that would have been the case at all, actually. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to be captured. Nobody wants to die. Everybody wants to make sure that their buddy's okay. That's probably the number one fear, is making sure you take care of the person you're kind of entrusted to drive with, be a battle buddy to.
How would you describe the morale of our troops in Iraqi freedom? Did people, obviously it's soon after 9/11, there was a lot of patriotism in the wake of 9/11. We invaded Afghanistan, and everybody thought that was a natural outgrowth of, since we had to go get Al-Qaeda, and then Iraq kind of fell in next in line, sort of being brought into the war on terror, even though there was a lot of debate as to whether they really were someone that we should be fighting in a war on terror. Would you say that the morale was very high among everyone there, that we were there for the right cause?
I think it was for us at the time. I think for people who went back for subsequent tours, probably don't have that same experience again and again, because I think that first tour was really hard. It was really long. It was 400 days. So I think going back to the same space, maybe seeing that not much more had been accomplished, not much more land had been held, not much more peace had been restored, not much more clean water was available for the people there who were just trying to live their day to day. There wasn't any work for anybody because there was a war going on. So people were hungry. They didn't have shelter as far as the civilian population there. I think at some point that does really get disheartening. But initially, especially because I was there when Saddam Hussein was captured, I think there was a lot of pride and patriotism and camaraderie among us. And there wasn't any divisiveness as far as why we were there or any political aspect of it. I think mostly because we all joined, for the most part, for the right reasons. And we all joined knowing we might be called to do something just like that. So it wasn't unexpected. I think we were actually ready to go do the job that we'd all trained so long to do.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, we deposed Saddam very quickly, right? So that part of the war was over very quickly, but then it was dealing with, I guess, insurgents, kind of an internal civil war that essentially broke out with a vacuum of power.
Right. And actually, when Saddam Hussein was captured, we all thought we were going home. We were all like, hooray, it's over. We didn't have any idea that was really just the beginning of what was going to be going on there. That, him being out of power in that moment wasn't going to solve the longstanding problems for governance and all of the social and economic problems for the people there, that yes, other terrorists would come in and fill that space, or, people just didn't have any autonomy or right to work, to move to another town, because of all the other cultural factors. So, yeah, I mean, I think it was a surprise to a lot of us. We were probably naive,
Yeah. So you were there when he was captured.
Yeah.
And that must have been quite a party that night.
It really was. I mean, we all kind of heard the news break out through our radio channels, and it was, we literally thought we were all going home. We thought the war was over.
Yeah. And and then he was hung in like the public square, wasn't he?
Yeah. That I didn't see.
Yeah. Crazy. So, and then how much longer were you still there after they captured Saddam?
Until the spring of the next year. So actually quite a long time before we handed our space at Al Assad in kind of that northwest corner over to a Marine infantry unit who took over the operations.
So already you were seeing things dragging on and on and on and not being a smooth transition. So was it starting to wear on your and everyone else's morale at that point? Kind of realizing that this thing is not going to end anytime soon?
I think so. I think that seemed to be a big part of the mission originally, was, capturing him and some of the other key leaders in his government seemed to be the focus. So once that was over, I know that we expected to have a different sort of a transition. We had a few other operations that were related to what we were doing that we were supporting, as far as training police officers, as far as training some of the Iraqi Guard, holding prisoners, and other things related to the security and the turnover. And those were noticeably unsuccessful to us, I think. So I don't know that we really talked about it at the time, because at the time it was just, it was very much the now. Looking back, I think we were getting tired. Being deployed for close to a year, plus the bookends of, going over and coming home and debriefing, that's a long time.
Mm-hmm. And what about fighting terrorism? You had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later became ISIS. Was that something that really was a big focus, that you guys were trying to keep that tamped down?
As far as what we were doing, really supporting, the war, we were attached to the 3rd Armored Cavalry. So we were attached to, the Abrams tankers, the Bradleys, and the Apaches. And we were the support function for them. Through their checkpoints, their raids, the gathering of their intelligence, the collecting of weapons, all of what they were doing. Yeah, I think that was the primary mission. And, it just seemed like endless.
Yeah.
There was always somebody else filling that space. And whether they could be described as somebody connected to one of those groups or otherwise somewhat random, or that was hard for us to know, because there was definitely a variety of threats, I'd say.
And then, it stretches on, and then Obama came in and basically pulled us entirely out of Iraq, which obviously, a lot of people question that move, because then it seemed that ISIS really took hold after that move. Did you have any thoughts about that when it was happening, as somebody who had spent over a year there, and to see us arguably abandon the mission?
I think that's a mixed bag for me, because kind of there's two competing things. One, of course, any of the space that was hard won, and I mean hard won with blood, you don't want to give it back. You want to make sure that has the right transition into what it was you hoped for it to be. But at the same time, some of the people who didn't get out after that deployment, who went back and got injured, who went back and got killed, who went back 3, 4, or 5 times, I mean, it devastated a lot of families too. So without a larger pool of people who are willing to stand up and say, hey, you know what, I believe in this too. I want to be a part of it. I want to join the military. I want to be the next one on that deployment. Without a larger pool of those people, I think it was taking a toll on the existing force. And so what I didn't want to see was the force get so worn down, so tired, have so much attrition, because after about the 3rd deployment for most people were starting to get out. And then you're replacing all this combat experience with brand new people, because there wasn't enough rest time, or, in between, somebody knew they were going to go back in a year. So, those two things are definitely competing.
Yeah.
I hate to see everybody pull out right away, but at the same time, hate to see the same people go back.
Yeah, a lot of that is kind of captured in American Sniper, which I assume you saw, because he was on multiple assignments. Right. And also you see them taking very, as you say, hard fought ground. I think it's Fallujah was his major battle that's kind of in there. And it, as you're watching the movie, by the time the movie had come out, I believe we had already left Iraq and it had fallen back into ISIS hands. So you're watching this movie, you think, oh my gosh, this is so sad to see our soldiers dying to gain this land, and then to know that we just abandoned it later. But we also see the point that you're making, which is that these guys were under major strain going on third and fourth operations.
Yeah, and I saw that same thing on TV when ISIS started coming back into northern Iraq. The same road I drove, the same place where I could have stopped at a roadside stand and bought a tomato or a date if I would have wanted to, or a block of ice. That was relatively controlled space, never really safe, but to watch the insurgents roll down that was just an unbelievable feeling to think, wow, that's where that's at now. That it was sad to see.
Yeah. And then Iran, of course, pours in to the country. And as it stands right now, I imagine still in quite a state of quite a mess still in Iraq.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Absolutely. If with kind of the makeup of the country and the way that the cultural groups interact or don't, with the way that the provincial leaders interact or don't, and I think that makes governing the country a challenge, and that was something I think we realized when we were looking at training some of the Iraqi Guard to start to take over posts or take over checkpoints. And that was, you can't gather up people from different tribes and different provinces, put them together in one place for a single training, and then put them back out into areas that they weren't used to living in, because they don't function that way. And so there were a lot of errors there in us believing that doing it that way was actually going to control the country in a way that, maybe would work in a lot of other places. It didn't work there.
So I can't imagine there's a lot of women in the Iraqi army. I'm going to guess zero.
I wouldn't think so, yeah.
Did you have any interesting interactions with your Iraqi counterparts, considering that you're a woman?
Really just some of the school teachers. One of the jobs we had kind of on a civil operation was to, spend some time in the community, and give people some assurance that there would be some business as usual, whatever that was. And where I was, that was opening a school back up that had been closed while Saddam Hussein was in power. That had previously been a girls' school. And so the school was opened back up, and we were there to kind of guard it and check in and have afternoon tea, and just to watch the women do, what they do to teach there. I know we talk a lot about teachers here, teaching there. I got to hand it to them. It's very dangerous, and they have very little resources. There's no electricity in these buildings. There's no school lunch. There's no materials. And they just kind of lecture and talk about what they do, but they were very, very hesitant to interact with us. It was very much head down, eyes down. Because the fear, especially after Desert Storm, a lot of the women old enough to remember as adults would know that, getting on the side of America today may not help you tomorrow. It depends on what we do. And if we leave, that was a bad move. And so they were very fearful to trust and openly show trust toward us.
Yeah, that's certainly, I'm sure, a challenge we had there. And we're dealing with in Afghanistan right now, where we're always saying, we're leaving soon. And it's like, okay, I guess you're saying that to the American public who's getting tired of the war, but letting your supporters in that country know that you're leaving soon and letting the adversary know that doesn't seem like it's very wise.
Yeah, it does put them in a predicament if there's no safeguard after we're gone, for them to either, and no infrastructure for them to continue on in what it was we were trying to do. If there isn't a government that's going to provide some protection, if there isn't, economy, and that's really a lot of what the fight is going to be over, is resources. As long as the people are poor and starving, they can be very easy to control.
So, before we get to more of the women's issues, tell us about your experience with PTSD. I mean, do you feel you suffered from it, and
Mhm.
perhaps some of your fellow service members.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And I think initially, since we were in one of the earlier waves of being in the Middle East, as much as we hear about it now, and as much as we look back and think about previous conflicts, and have always been able to identify what PTSD is, no matter what you call it, there wasn't very good recognition of it then at the time, and I don't think there was for a lot of us in ourselves, because it's something that happened over a period of time, that we learned to deal and cope with in a particular environment, and then we just changed environments. And I think initially we thought everything that we were doing at the time was normal, quote unquote normal, and whatever wasn't was going to change when the environment changed. You come home, there's no threats, everything's going to be fine. It just doesn't work that way. All that experience and all that time does do some hardwiring of the brain, and coming home and changing that environment, all that programming is still there. So there's some work that has to be done. For me, a lot of work that had to be done to reprogram that, to believe that seriously no one was going to be around the next corner looking to kill me, that I didn't have to check a roof or any of those things that just became a part of my day-to-day, because if I didn't do it, something terrible could happen. So I really had to rethink and go through that story and spend some time just getting back to a thought process that was going to work when I was back home, which isn't something you normally have to think about unless you have that experience.
Mm-hmm. So other than constantly being on edge, and as you say, kind of have to be deprogrammed, but were there more severe symptoms that you had also? Like, did it bring on things like depression or?
Absolutely. Just because I think a lot of people, and I did, just experience a lot of survivor guilt. There were people in my unit, David Kirchhoff and Aaron Sissel, who died there. There were 50 riflemen in the regiment who died while we were there. And so there's this idea that it puts a lot of pressure. First of all, it's just a terrible sadness because you don't go to a funeral and you don't meet the family, and someone just sort of disappears. And I think that's a hard way to lose somebody. And especially for us at night, when we're getting ready for a mission the next day, and you hear all the intel to get ready for that, those casualties and deaths are just a part of the intelligence that you use to prepare for the next day. And it just becomes a thing. And I think when I came home, I wanted to make sure that I finally gave all those moments the recognition that they needed. They were incredibly sad. They were incredibly tragic. And I needed to finally experience that grief. And then there was this pressure and for them, in their honor, I need to make my life something important, because they don't get that. And so that creates its own kind of unique pressure, I think, to live on even better.
Mm-hmm. So was there a treatment that you went through for that?
Mm-hmm. I did. I used my VA, did cognitive behavioral therapy, went to a lot of veterans events, retreats, weekend events, to spend some time openly sharing stories, talking about all that.
There's probably a very large percentage of soldiers who don't seek that treatment, though, that right. they don't think they need it, or they're see it as a sign of weakness or what have you.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. There are a lot of people who don't recognize it in themselves, who have a hard time believing that if I talk about this or tell this story or do this thing now, how's that going to change what happened? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't change what happened, but it does. It does help the story have some meaning, and that meaning, I think, in people, a lot of times they find their purpose, and then it just stops being a dead end road. I think the normal progression of thoughts when I was very depressed about it was absolutely terrible, and nothing's ever going to change it. That's true. So I do think you have to find a way to turn that around, and I think that kind of talk therapy and storytelling and spending time with veterans and kind of relieving that burden or sharing it, I think it helps. And I tell people all the time who say, but I tried it, it didn't work. Try something else. You just have to keep trying, because at the point where you stop trying, that's where I think the hopelessness sets in. That's where the downward spiral starts. And then that's where you really get into the places where, suicide becomes a real concern. And it has been for veterans.
Joblessness, homelessness, and suicides.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, part of it, again, is captured in that film where you come back and there's, first of all, you don't have the adrenaline rush that you've got in the combat zone. You also have nothing is life or death when you're back home. And you've got friends that you've lost there. You've got friends that are still serving there. And it's very hard to adjust mentally to the idea that I'm going to stay here in this simple life while their lives are still on the line.
Oh, absolutely. Had feelings that I wanted to go back right away. Wanted to go back in, wanted to go back to Iraq. Still do some days, which is just interesting to me because there just seems to be a part of my life that's still there. And there's a part of wanting to recapture it or relive it or understand it better. There's definitely that draw. That's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah. How would you try to explain that draw?
I don't know. Being in Iraq is not like being in another country. It's like being in another universe. All the rules are different. Everything operates differently. And I think when I first came back, I almost just didn't understand how it worked to be in Iowa. I just, like, for whatever reason, I didn't feel comfortable. And I was really angry all the time that somebody could have a good day, that somebody could, watch a comedy and laugh when all that was going on over there. Don't you care? Because it was still very much a part of my mind. I don't know how to explain it. It's just a whole other experience.
I would imagine some of it was probably the camaraderie, because when you are in a unit like that where everything is life or death, right? The bonding. I mean, I was in a college fraternity. Okay. So I'll use that as my silly comparison, but we did share a pretty significant bond because of the crap they make you go through and so on. But so here you've got this fraternity that's in the real world with real lives on the line, fighting a real important mission. And that's, you can't replicate that anywhere.
No, and I think there's a special challenge for people who are deployed out of the Guard and the reserves for that reason, because active duty units come home to their active duty post and they spend time together regrouping, retraining, and doing that as a group. So that structure still exists. When people come back from a deployment and they were in the National Guard or the reserves, they all disperse back to their hometowns to be farmers and firefighters and teachers and everything else. And they might drill on a weekend 2 months later. And so kind of splintering apart that support network that you had in that environment, I think that's a special challenge for Guard people too.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems as if counseling ought to be mandatory for people coming back. I mean, it almost seems impossible not to have PTSD coming back from that situation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was in Fort McCoy, Wisconsin for, I think, 3 days before I ended up back home. So about a 24-hour flight between Baghdad, Germany, Maine, and Wisconsin, and then 3 days later in my living room. That's not the best way to do it, I don't think. I don't even know that it would be called counseling, but there should be some transition time, and I do think they're getting better at that. They do recognize that now. At the time when I was there, honestly, when they do a fitness or an emotional fitness screening on your way out of the country, and they just gave us the answers. And you're like, don't answer number one with A, or you'll end up here for a week talking to a shrink. Everybody wanted to go home. So it's like 1 is C, 2 is B. You just filled it out. Have you ever wanted to kill somebody? I don't know. Like, when? It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right place to get at some sort of a real screening. So just some sort of a decompression time to normalize that as the normal experience of coming home from war, in the same way that there's a ramp up. You go somewhere else, there's a battle checklist for your unit to be screened, to be ready to go. You know, we spent 3 months at Fort McCoy checking all those boxes. Yes, everybody wants to see their family, but give yourself some decompression time that's at least half that long, to at least give credit to the fact that when we send you home, we want you to be successful with your family, successful in life, and we want you to stay in the military because this was a valuable experience. So these are the experiences we actually want military people to bring if we ever have to get called to do something like this again.
Something we've covered on the show a few times before is a therapy called EMDR. You ever heard of the EMDR?
I have.
Have you ever actually had it?
I have not had it, but I know some people who have, and it has been successful for them. So that's why I tell anybody who talks to me about it. You know, people don't know what's going to work specifically for them. Speak to them, reach them wherever they're at. If that's one of the things, I'd absolutely recommend it.
Yeah, we've covered it both as far as soldiers coming back and for treatments for various things, and even for children. I mean, anything that trauma has permanent effects on the brain. And I think for children, it probably has even more permanent effects because you have a developing brain. So childhood trauma is something where it needs to be used for. You know, one thing that just occurs to me is when you think about how many men served in World War II that came back, and PTSD wasn't even a thing then, yet all of them probably came back with some form of that. And most of them probably kept it to themselves because it wasn't something that was spoken of at the time.
And not being spoken about probably didn't improve the quality of their life, which, you know, for a country, for an America, to truly honor people who are willing to volunteer to be in a position like that. Of course, World War II is a little different, but who were able to pick up a rifle and follow. You know, I just think we owe that group of people more. And part of that would be offering them some kind of decompression, and that's treating them right when they get back. That's being able to have the conversation, not having that being stigmatized.
Tell us a story or two that are kind of your favorites from the book, you know, in particular about the uniqueness of being a woman in what was primarily a male-dominated environment.
Unique stories or good stories from that time. Well, I have to at least give credit to the other women who were there with me, because we very much looked out for each other. When they say that it is more likely that a woman's going to be assaulted in the military by someone in a unit than, you know, being attacked by Al Qaeda or a terrorist group. That's absolutely true. So there were a lot of women who were there with me, who were always watching out on both sides. And I think that's probably the hardest thing about being a woman in the military. It was then. I think that still exists now. I think it's getting better. I think we have a long way to go. So they really would, you know, look out for me. I know one time when I was going over to the Syrian border to work at a checkpoint, and there were no other women there, and it was just going to be me and my co-driver, and that would have been fine because, you know, he was a good guy and he would have looked out for me, but just the idea of it probably not being the best way. One of the women who was a prison guard in her civilian job here at home, I think they had a nickname for her that was something like that too. But she said, you know what, I'm going to go with you. And they were like, you're not on the roster. This isn't your mission. You're not the driver. And she's like, no, you don't understand. I'm going to go with her. And I was like, oh, shit. And she did. And we kind of slept back to back in that room while we were up at that checkpoint, just not even knowing, and that's the sad part is, most of the guys that we worked and trained with, they were the best of the best. They were great people. But you just don't know where the other people are. You don't know where the bad apples are. And we certainly didn't know, working with another unit, who everybody was. So she was always looking out for me like that. And I don't think we slept the whole time we were there. So,
and were there actual incidents of assaults within the ranks on females while you were there?
Nothing that I can tell you that I witnessed, but do I believe those things happened? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, they happen back here domestically too.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. I guess the question is, is it a unique concern in the military, or kind of the same concern we have generally?
I tend to think of it as generally the same issue. I think for a long time that was a part of the argument that said, I don't know if women should be in these spaces. It's too intense, or when guys are all amped up, this is what happens. I don't actually, that was a very poor argument for women getting the opportunity to reach their full potential and do really well in some of these jobs where they excelled ahead of their male peers, because it's a crime of violence. It's not a crime of gender. It's a crime of power and control. And people who do that in the military do it in the civilian world. And I think the profile is pretty much the same. So I think in the military, having higher values for, what our conduct should be ideally, I just think we have to do a good job about kicking them people out. And that would be the best way to solve that problem, and not to limit where women go, how they work, train, and fight. But you find the bad apples, you have a real strong line on just getting them the hell out of there.
So our military went from not allowing women at all to allowing them in certain roles to now essentially permitting them in all roles. Yeah. But of late has even taken it further than that, which is actually demonstrating affirmative action toward women and encouraging women to join the military more so than men, promoting women based on their sex, or giving them an edge based, affirmative action. Basically, I got two equal candidates, one's male, one's female, and I'm going to give it to the female because, we want more women leaders, or we want more women, in the military. And I mean, I've got direct knowledge in talking to various members of the military about that, both in recruiting, that advantages are given to women in recruitment over men, and in promotions. So I don't know if you are aware of the same things I'm aware of, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Are we going too far when we've gotten rid of all discrimination, or not all discrimination, but we're saying that discrimination against women is wrong? Women should be allowed in the military as long as they're able to meet the same standards as the men, but to the point where we're going to promote a woman over a man simply because of her sex.
I don't have any direct knowledge of that. So you are telling me something I don't know. I think for a long time, women were not promoted simply because of their gender, who met the qualifications. That I've definitely seen. I think if you had two male candidates who were equally qualified for a job, the person on the board, or whoever is going to decide who gets promoted, is going to promote the person they like the best. I don't know if you would call that discrimination or not, if they're both qualified. But I would say that I think the right way to go is simply the best qualified person. I mean, it just is. When we're looking at life on the line, a lot of money, a lot of power and control, a lot of complex pieces. Once you start to get up above the field grade officer level, it's got to be best qualified person. And I think when we break down the barriers to be able to say, if you're best qualified as a woman, you can get promoted, then we're going to solve some of those issues, once people are able to enter those areas. And and compete fairly, but I think it's still got to be fair competition. I don't know that promoting anybody based on gender is ever right. If it wasn't right when it was a man, it just can't be when it's a woman or for any other reason at all.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you 100%. I mean, for the reasons that you stated, I mean, most important thing is we're talking about lives on the line, huge money on the line, defense of our country on the line. So best qualified should always be the case. And it's going to take a while for women to ascend into higher roles because they're relatively new to the military. A good comparison is in the practice of law. Law schools are now made up of majority women over men. But I've seen articles written, oh my gosh, why are partners in law firms primarily men? It's like, well, because to be a partner at a law firm, you have to have been practicing for a long time, and they're going to age out eventually. And as women come through the ranks, you are going to see much higher percentages. But be patient. It's going to have. We don't need to suddenly say, oh no, we need the numbers to be the same today. So starting now, we're going to give an advantage to women in becoming partner over a man, or in any promotions in the military. It's just, it's demoralizing, I think, to the person who's passed over. And I think for the person who gets the job where it's kind of obvious that it was because I'm a woman, or for that matter, a particular race, because these practices don't just involve women, it involves affirmative action with race. I mean, who wants to feel like they were promoted based on anything other than the merits?
No, absolutely. And, I have no doubt that the military sometimes does things that aren't their official policy, right? Because that's not an official military policy. They'll say they have no policy like that. They have no quotas. So what it is they're doing in practice right now that you're talking about, like I said, I'm not really sure, but that doesn't seem like it actually solves the problem, because we have to make sure, just like first day of basic training, if everybody's really green, and we're going to have to hold the line on that. But also we have to look at the policies that make women leave before they reach those ranks, because some of it is not just time. Women have been serving in real roles since, at least Vietnam. There's been plenty of decades for people to reach those ranks, but there's some other factors involved too. How do we handle the movements of a dual military couple? When you have a husband and wife, how often can they be at the same station so that choosing their career doesn't make them live apart most of their lives? How do they negotiate family, maternity leave, and being able to have the other parts of life when war's not going on, in order to encourage people to be able to stay in and then hold that experience and skill and all that time and money invested in the training for a person up to that point in their career, instead of always starting over again. So I think if we can look at those policies so that women feel like that's even an option once they're married and have families, especially in a dual military couple, then, there has been enough time if they're encouraged to stay.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And also, I just would love to see, tying it back to our prior discussion, instead of so much time, energy into diversity and inclusion, which is just the article I was just reading about today about the new chief of diversity and inclusion in the military. I don't know why it's an objective of the military to begin with to be diverse. Again, the objective should be to be a fighting military that destroys the opponent when necessary. But all the energy and effort going into, say, recruiting women to join the military, as opposed to just allowing whichever number of women want to join and going actively trying to recruit women, spending that time instead on being concerned about our veterans coming back and making sure they're getting proper treatment for things like PTSD and so on that we talked about earlier, I think would be a lot better use of their resources.
Well, and I think it's probably fair to point out that some of those areas that opened up to women were rooted in a recruitment shortage of men who were willing and available to do the job. So they started looking around mid-'80s, 90s, like, hey, wait a second. We don't have a country filled with 18-year-old fit men who really want to join the military. and they were having problems meeting numbers, and this idea that, hey, wait, women can do this job. That was also a part of the recruitment strategy for open. It wasn't like, oh, we're just going to include women now because women are equally capable. It was like, hey, we don't have guys. Mm-hmm. And I think that's still the case. Part of it might be trying to reach people who feel like the military has never been a part of their plan, never seen it as even an option to just tap into resources, because numbers wise, I think recruiting is always, going to be an issue. So that might be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're trying to maintain an all volunteer military, which we've had for a long time right now, mm-hmm. That's not always easy. I'm not sure exactly where they stand right now on being able to recruit the sufficient numbers, but that's an ongoing debate whether or not there mm-hmm. should be some type of a draft or a requirement. Certainly there's lots of countries out there where serving in the military is a civic duty that everyone must do, men and women. I know Israel for sure. Mm-hmm. Men and women all serve in the military.
I think it's a great idea personally, just because it gives people a real idea about what it means to give everything up for your country, for a cause. That's what a patriot does. I think sometimes right now we can get really involved in our own, you can buy the gear, you can play the games, and you can almost feel like you're there, but you're not there. You know what I mean? For being a patriot or being a soldier. And those metaphors, especially war metaphors, are used all the time in areas that don't have anything to do with the military, but that's not what it's about. I think that would be a very good taste of reality for lots of folks to, and helpful when we're even thinking about getting involved in a conflict, to be able to have a voting public who can say, I know what that sacrifice is like, just a little bit. I just did a year. I just did 2 years. So I have a little bit of an idea about what I'm asking somebody else to do right now. I think that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, we could use a bit more common purpose in this country right mm-hmm. now. Everybody's in their own camps, not working together on anything.
Yeah, no, I agree. That certainly brings it back to this one American ideal. What is it we should all be about? What is it we should all stand for? I mean, I think about, the Army values, something that we wore on a dog tag around our necks with our names and our blood types, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Those are Army values. They should be American values.
Thank you again to Miyoko. You can check out her book, All I Could Be, The Story of a Woman Warrior in Iraq, on Amazon. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.